Happy to be here today with Real Progressive's volunteer and writer Jonathan Kadmon, who's here to discuss his latest piece for RP. Jonathan, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to show everybody just the start of the piece here. This is at realprogressives.org. Please go to our website to find all of our great content, including pieces from folks like Jonathan. It's titled "The National Debt and Other Red Herrings." Do you want to just go ahead and dive in and start explaining that concept, Jonathan?
Yeah, it was. I started with wanting to write an article, that explained the things, especially that play into inflation that I kind of wish had been explained to me when I started learning this stuff. And, there's a lot of, that we've been seeing on social media, a lot of what I call Groucho Marx economics, where people like Larry Summers are telling us things that we can see very clearly are not true. But it kind of helps to understand exactly why it's not true and what does and doesn't play into inflation. And I kind of start with, the things that I found confusing when I started out, which was the money supply and stocks and flows. And, the fact that the quantity isn't really what's important. It's where it's going, where it is, and what it's doing. And, there's a lot that goes into it. And I tried to stay away from stuff that went into sticky details or would have required a lot of deep dives. I let some of the links do the heavy lifting for me. But I tried to make this, kind of as simple to understand, because it really is not that complicated, but it requires learning a lot of assumptions we made when we started out. So I kind of start by explaining that basically the national debt is the collection of all of the deficit spending we've done. And it essentially amounts to all of the money, all of the dollars that are in existence that haven't been taxed back yet. And if that sounds kind of glib and meaningless, that's because it is. It doesn't tell you anything you need to know. And I start talking about stocks and flows. And that's basically where the money is, what it's doing. And in essence, the most important thing to keep in mind is the things that we think of as money. The stuff that you trade back and forth and buy things with is really only a tiny, tiny percentage of the money supply. And that's really the only thing that is even available to chase after goods and services that could possibly bid up prices. And
can you just briefly start for the non-economists out there, can you explain what else compiles the money supply outside of what we kind of think of?
Stocks and bonds are a big chunk of it. Most of it is, either savings accounts, stocks and bonds. The vast majority of it is sitting in retirement accounts of various sorts. So something like 20% of that total money supply that's included in that, 28 trillion, that's on the deficit clock. Like more than 20% of it is in what's called intragovernmental holdings. So that means the Social Security Trust Fund, the Medicare Trust Fund, the VA Retirement Trust Fund. These are just sitting in accounts. They're not dollars that are circulating in the economy chasing after goods and services. And so, the way people are taught to think of this stuff is that it's one big pile of money in this very oversimplified thing. It requires that you assume there's one big pile of money. It's all going into one big market and everybody's taken from the same big pile of money. And to them, it makes sense, that if you increase the quantity of it, it's worth less. But that's not how it works at all.
So can you then, from that kind of context, can you start to break down some of our perhaps misunderstandings of inflation and what actually may cause prices to increase?
What actually may cause prices to increase, you've actually been discussing here. Like I remember a couple of weeks ago, you did a segment talking about the CEOs of various corporations more or less bragging to their shareholders at the quarterly meeting that they've been jacking up prices well above and beyond, the increases in their costs. And they've managed to do it without, putting a significant dent in demand. And, they are essentially price gouging on things that people need, and so that they have to spend more money on, even if they don't really have it. And that's a big chunk of it. I linked to, an article by Matt Stoller, who, did some simple math and, got a ballpark guess that roughly 60% of the price increases are coming from, monopolists and people at various choke points in the supply chains, that have the leverage to jack up prices well above and beyond their increased costs. The other part of it on the supply and capital end of things is the supply chains, which again also have to do with monopolies. I linked to a David Dian article in there where he's talking about how with that increased consolidation, a lot of them have also been kind of merging these increasingly like fragile and standardized supply chains. They've all been putting their eggs in one basket, so to speak. And so with the slightest disruption, in essence, everybody is suffering delays. And, it doesn't have that kind of loose coupling or flexibility to recover or adjust to changes in the situation. And they're doing all of this in the interest of pinching pennies that they can then pass on to their shareholders, which will then in turn translate into bonuses for executives and, things of that nature. And, people at the bottom are really who are paying for all of that.
Yeah, as the Fed chair even admitted this, Jerome Powell, in questioning from Senator Warren, he openly just admitted they're raising prices because they can. That was the way he put it. So I think that's a spot on analysis. Can you start to get in a little bit to, we tend to think of, you mentioned this earlier, that inflation is a result of, or we tend to often blame, I should say, public spending for inflation or for price increases. Can you just debunk a little bit of that? A lot of countries around the world, I've heard MMTers routinely reference Japan, can't even hit their inflation targets. The Fed has come out and acknowledged we don't have a valid theory of inflation, et cetera. Can you just sort of break down why that's not an accurate way to represent the situation?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Japan in the first paragraph. It has the largest national debt to GDP ratio in the world, and they have been deficit spending for the last 20 years, desperately attempting what the Fed calls inflationary policy, trying to keep their prices above par. And one of the things that we're also not taught very well is another name for a deflationary spiral is depression. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, depressions happen when prices start falling, assembly lines stop, businesses shutter, people get laid off. Deflation can be very, very bad for an economy. In fact, per percentage change, it's a lot worse for the economy than inflation is. And Japan has been trying desperately to stave it off by, government spending and deficit spending. And, they are like, the fact of the matter is that doesn't work. It doesn't, it like what the Fed calls inflationary policy doesn't actually cause inflation. And, a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's a lot of steps between, the government spending that money and that money getting into what we might call the real economy of goods and services, especially to the people with the highest propensity to spend it on goods and services. There's a lot of myths regarding that, particularly are put out there by people like Larry Summers, who freaks out at the notion that anybody in the poor or working classes might get a little more money in their pocket. He talks about the economy running hot, but it doesn't really do that. And I kind of explain why in the article. There are other ways of, removing money from the pool of aggregate demand that people don't think of because the government isn't doing it. But recurring monthly payments, like bills, like college debt loans, like mortgage loans, utility bills, rents, all of that siphons money out of the real economy of goods and services That's money out of your pocket that you can no longer spend on things. And what most people said, which I also mentioned in the article, that they did with their stimulus check is pay bills and buy basic groceries, and whatever was left over they used to pay down debts. All of that goes out of the real economy of goods and services and does not bid up demand. And the demand has been, it's recovered a little bit since things started opening back up, but that was the biggest factor. And demand is actually at or below where it was before the pandemic started. And what people like Larry Summers are using to make the case that the economy is running hot is consumer spending. And spending is not demand. Spending is up because prices are. And the price increase happened before the increase in consumer spending. The spending is largely on things people need, or would have bought before. And, people are just trying to get by at a certain baseline, which they are now struggling to do because the prices have been increased. So I think it's important that people understand how that works.
Yeah, I absolutely. Can you just briefly touch on where what I would describe as like sort of a perverse incentive comes from in terms of how this is reported and how the mainstream press likes to present these issues over the past, especially year or so since that stimulus bill?
I mean, I think a lot of it isn't necessarily even perverse incentives in the way they're presenting it. I think a lot of it has to do with the widespread miseducation that's been going on for many years. Like, a lot of these people in the press don't know any better. And, a long time ago, these used to be kind of kitchen table issues. But, issues of economics and finance have been talked about for so long as though they were highly, erudite issues that only people with PhDs should be talking about, and the rest of us don't need to worry our pretty little heads about, has caused, a profound degree of ignorance about, basic things that, really we should know if we don't want to be taken advantage of. And, where do you go to learn these things? We're, at Real Progressives, we're kind of trying to be that place where you can go to get that basic information and education so that, you kind of, a little better. But I don't necessarily think everybody in the media in particular is circulating this stuff because, they have perverse incentives, although there's definitely some people that are. Like, when you go to CNBC, there's a lot of those people represent Wall Street hedge funds and those sorts of interests that are, essentially, if you look at some of the stocks and flows I was describing in the article, you can see how, nearly every apparent windfall to the working and middle class is, in very short order, siphoned upward into these, basically into these treasure hoards of these, kind of, corporate and Wall Street, like the dragon Smog in the Lord of the Rings, in the Hobbit. They're just hoarding all this treasure and, basically sucking up all that they can find. And, the people like Larry Summers and, the people on these, a lot of these financial shows, will try and run interference for that sort of thing and try to pressure the Fed to, essentially, hurt poor people, so that the status quo can be maintained for those at the top.
Yeah.
And there's other interests too that also want to maintain the status quo. Obviously the, monopolistic corporations, meatpacking industry, the Walmarts and the Amazons on the retail end of things that want to maintain their chokehold, on the supply chains and, the distribution of a lot of the stuff that Americans need.
Yeah, absolutely. I was also hoping you could touch a little bit on we've actually had Dr. Fadl Kaboub on to talk about this recently with his talk about inflation. So if for the viewers, if you haven't seen that Real Progress in Action YouTube channel, it was a great discussion from Dr. Kaboub. But I was hoping that Jonathan, you might be able to touch a little bit on his notion that you actually might want to increase deficit spending to combat inflation. Can you talk a little bit about how that dynamic works?
Right. It's about the targeting of where the spending goes, and making sure that people have a certain baseline standard of living that actually increases their productivity and increases kind of the forgot what the fiscal space, I think, is what he calls it. For us to actually expand, what the government is doing. Like, we create more real resources when we're more productive, and the only real limit to how much the government can spend are the real resources it can muster to do things and to back up that money. And as long as we have that fiscal space, we can continue to do whatever it is we need to do to make this a better place. And
to put it in internet speak, we can have nice things, right? That
yes, we absolutely can. Like, Medicare for all, he has said, and other colleagues of his have said, Warren Mosler in particular, would actually be deflationary.
Mm-hmm.
And that it probably should be combined with something like a jobs guarantee would be ideal, because part of the reason it would be deflationary is the fact that it would take a lot of that, as toxic a space as the health insurance industry is, it employs a lot of people.
Yeah.
And unemployment is a huge drain on that fiscal space.
Yep.
Keeping those people employed increases productivity across the board and generates a lot more than you would be investing in creating that baseline pay scale. I think another one of the misconceptions a lot of people have, including my libertarian brother, who I sent this article to, and he told me he hated it, is like the way they think of these things is they think that money stops at the people getting paid, but it doesn't. It keeps circulating around. It gets used for things. It gets invested in things. It gets, and this is what countries around the world have found in people whose GDP is a lot less than ours. When they invest in their people, the returns are astronomical, and it's surprisingly stable and does not cause inflation. In fact, it causes a level of stability that you can't get without it. Like the people, investing in the people creates stability. The greatest period of stability in our history was after a major investment in the people in the post-World War II era, when everybody rose and across the board, and there was not a huge income gap.
No. In fact, what did we call the 60s then? The golden era of economics in this country? I mean, that's the result from that kind of public spending.
Yeah, absolutely. And when everybody's position is getting better, that benefits everybody. And it's the greatest era of stability and productivity in this country's history came directly from those kinds of policies. And frankly, the people that have managed to claw all that stuff back and accumulate all of the wealth and power in this country, in the intervening years, are terrified of precisely that sort of thing happening, because they might have to, let go of some of it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think people are starting to see that more, but they need to understand the how in order to
fully understand the whole.
Pull the plug on it. Yeah.
Yes. Hey, so you touched on something that's maybe a little bit unrelated from the inflation thing, but I just want to briefly. It's important for MMT, and I want to make sure that you can explain this to the audience. How we're forced to be in this spot. You mentioned the deflationary pressure that Medicare for All would bring. We're in this sort of nuanced spot where we're arguing for a policy, and yet we're kind of saying that it shouldn't be paired with a tax increase. Can you just talk about why it's important to understand MMT so that we can properly discuss these issues and how they should be implemented?
That's a big one. Like,
Mm-hmm.
MMT is it's a descriptive. It's understanding how the system works, and when you understand, um, the the cause and effect, and what's actually going to happen when you implement the policy, you actually have the ability to. Um, I'm not sure exactly what you're looking for here.
Just like how it's important for when we talk about Medicare for All and the populace, it tends to be in progressive crowds that also want to increase taxes on the rich. So we're forced rhetorically into this corner where it's like, you know what I mean? We want Medicare for All for the people, but it actually shouldn't be paired with a tax increase. But at the same time, we should shift the current tax burden to the rich. And we're kind of in this very nuanced space. And I'm just hoping you can kind of talk about that a little bit.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things people need to understand about that, that core thing that I was discussing earlier about fiscal space, it's all about, it's the real resources and productivity that dictates what the government can do, not tax revenues. Mm-hmm. And the role of tax revenues is largely redistributive and allocative. But the fact is, you don't need to even take tax revenues into consideration when you're deciding what it is we should or shouldn't do. Like, right. That shouldn't be part of the consideration. That having been said, some people misunderstand what some of our people are saying, including on social media. They're drawing the conclusion that MMT says we shouldn't tax the rich. That's right. Absolutely not true. Like, right. One of the things that MMT has and that it draws on is, frankly, a better understanding of how the accumulation of wealth and money often translates into power and leverage. And the fact of the matter is, a fistful of people, in this country and globally have accumulated so much that, it's kind of like a black hole, like sucking in everything around it. And, the degree to which, that is happening, like it shouldn't be allowed, and taxation is a tool to combat that. Like, allocative efficiency is critical to to making this kind of policy work. But you absolutely do not need any tax revenues, right, to make money. Like, where money right. comes from is the critical part of what MMT explains. And when you start to understand that, a whole lot of other things make sense.
Kind of fall into the puzzle starts to kind of piece itself together once you understand the nature of currency. So just to circle back,
I wish I was taught that.
One more time.
Yeah, it's among those other things that I kind of wish I was taught earlier. It's one of those things that, it took me a while to, when I was learning this stuff, to really kind of dig into that and understand, what modern fiat currency is and where it comes from, how it derives its value. Things like that are things people kind of take for granted but don't really understand anymore.
Yes, 100%. And just for those that really want to do a deep dive on that particular topic, I wish I could link it for you or something, but there is a Randall Ray lecture on YouTube that is about the history of money, and he dives into this stuff on a deep level. So for those at home who might be interested, you can go find that. Randall Ray is fantastic on that stuff. And Jonathan, I just want to circle back to the inflation piece one more time. If there's one message that you really want people to take away from reading this piece, can you just kind of sum it up for them?
It doesn't matter the amount of debt or deficit because a country can't have debt denominated in its own currency. It's the source of that currency. What matters is where it's going and how it's being allocated. And that's what you need to take away from this, is most of what's being circulated around there is nonsense. The main thing you need to know is where that government spending is going is way more important than how much of it there is.
Fantastic summary, and I really encourage my readers or my viewers rather to go read the piece, realprogressives.org, for that piece and others. There's another piece on a similar topic from Artemis about how greed drives up inflation. So you can go find all sorts of great content there on realprogressives.org. Jonathan, thank you so much for taking the time today, and I hope to have you on again soon.